But here's the issue I take. Like you say these stories about Bernie Sanders. I'm like, yeah, well, that's why I liked him. Liked, past tense. And then when he basically, got on his knee and kissed Hillary Clinton's pinky ring, I'm like, this guy's got no principles. I don't care what he's fighting for. He could have absolutely said, I'm not going to endorse her. Sorry, have a nice day. And that's it. But instead, he was like, whatever the machine needs of me. And now what is he doing? I mean, this is a guy who in the 2016 cycles, in 2015, said that open borders is a Koch brothers proposal to, to exploit these workers and things like that. And then come the 2020, the 2019 primaries and all that stuff. He's talking about open borders and free medical care for non-citizens and stuff. He totally flipped on all his positions. That's what I see when I see like the squad. AOC, man, I remember as soon as she got elected, all of a sudden her stance on Palestine and Israel started shifting. Activists started getting really angry, like, what's going on? Why is she walking this back? She needs to, because she didn't know what she was talking about, right? So they get in and they just say, tell me where the line is and I will toe it.
Look, I think part of this is that, we think about these members of Congress as like what they're doing in Congress with legislation, hearings, briefings, investigations, so on and so forth. But I think this newer breed of members of Congress, and there's people on the right who are this way as well, I think they see a lot of their constituency the same way as like an Instagram influencer or like a celebrity sees their constituency, right? Like as long as they're making a lot of progress in terms of the retweets, the likes, the shares, the subscribers, they're raising a heck of a lot of money. I think AOC is one of the best fundraisers in Congress because of all her small donor base and her support. I think they see themselves as achieving some level of success, right? And maybe they will even achieve long-term political success in their careers by doing it. But it isn't necessarily the most effective or the best way to move things in Congress. I mean, I'll give you an example. I think that, Rashida Tlaib or Ilhan Omar, they get in a lot of hot water talking about Israel and the Middle East. But what exactly have they accomplished on those issues? Like, I can't think of them. They aren't any of the authors of any of the primary legislation on Middle East human rights issues. That's Betty McCollum or some other members of Congress. When there was a recent outbreak of fighting between Israel and Gaza, it was John Ossoff, who was a very kind of low-key senator from Georgia who organized the letter calling for a ceasefire. It wasn't Ilhan Omar or Rashida Tlaib. Sometimes being the more like outspoken, Twitter punchy type person, maybe it'll get your applause, your fan base, and make you a little bit of a celebrity. But it isn't necessarily the way to actually move things in Congress and actually carve out, some progress. And I think, I mean, to be fair to them, I do think that they have sometimes unrealistic expectations put on them. I mean, they're freshman members of Congress, so they're like, some of them have been there for 2 terms now. Normally, when you're in that position, you're not going to be that effective just because of how the House operates. Now, the Senate's very different. You can be very effective as a first-term senator, or very, very impactful. But the House is a little bit different. So some of the expectations are maybe a little unfair on them, but also at the same time, I think of them more as influencers and I think of them as lawmakers because that's mostly what they do. I
think I will refer to this as the AOC phenomenon. How is it that she is such an effective fundraiser? The way I describe it is imagine you have 100 cities and in those cities, 40% are Republican, 42% are Democrat. And then you've got a mishmash of Libertarian and Green Party and unaffiliated, whatever. Well, I think those numbers are probably unfair because probably it's like thirds is probably independent voters. But the point is, ignoring that, let's say that out of each city, 1% is Democratic, Socialist, pro-AOC. Now, if you're in that city and you're trying to fundraise, you're not going to make any money because you're like, you got one person who can donate to you. But what if you could tap into the power of the internet? And now you have every major city across the country. Those in each and every city where there's just one person who believes what you believe, all of a sudden now through the internet, they're connected to you and funneling money to you. And now all of a sudden AOC is raising money outside of her district. And it's a new phenomenon. They talk about the squad members getting, I think most of their donations came from outside, like the substantial amount, like 97% or whatever, came not from their own districts. So what they're doing is they're taking the fringe of each and every city. They're online, speaking up, sending money to AOC. AOC is not, I would say she's popular in the sense that all of those people are loud now. But if we were to, if this was before the internet era, she would not be considered popular, I'd imagine, right? You'd have.
It's interesting because an equivalent figure, if you go back to like the pre-social media era, would maybe be like Dennis Kucinich, right? Like Kucinich was probably the most left-wing member of Congress. He was a Democratic congressman from Ohio. He ran for president a couple times with basically the Bernie platform. Didn't really get anywhere. But it's exactly that. Like Kucinich is power base was his actual district in Cleveland, in Ohio, or like in Cleveland area, Ohio. He wasn't tapping into a large sort of internet, social media fan base that maybe represented a small sliver of America, but could give him tons and tons of money, the same way that I think, really starting with Ron Paul. Like Ron Paul on the right, on the libertarian side, represented sort of a minority faction of people, but he was able to mobilize a tremendous number of internet donors, some of which transferred into volunteers, which increased his profile, which actually gave him a real platform and a voice in the political debates, and actually it gave him some surprising performance in those couple of primaries that he ran in. I remember The Daily Show had a really fun segment about how, like, he got maybe second in a state and, like, the major media didn't even mention it, but, like, he obviously was doing very well, punching well above his weight. Ron Paul started that, and I think Bernie Sanders continued it. And now you have people who I would argue are much less impactful than someone like a Bernie Sanders, which is the Squad, who've carved out their social media niches. And I think they provide them with enough money to basically fend off any kind of challenger within their district, which would only come from within their party, because they're all very Democratic-leaning districts. But that simply isn't the way that you actually change things in Congress. The fulcrum of Congress is typically the swing districts, right? It's the districts that a party can't afford to lose, and the ones that give them the majority and the control of the committees and the chairs, but which are always very competitive, because I don't think you can be AOC talking about prison abolition. I mean, that's the real thing that she's talked about, and win any swing district anywhere in America. That would be turned into an advertisement by the Republicans, and you'd be gone in the next cycle. But you can, sitting in a district that, I don't know if her district is like D plus 30 or 40 or something.
D plus 30.
Yeah, it's pretty up there. You can say basically anything you want, right? It'd be very hard for anyone to defeat her. Incumbents very rarely lose any kind of primary challenge, and particularly in that kind of left wing of a district. I mean,
Nancy Pelosi said you could take this glass of water, put a D on it, and it would win in AOC's or my district. They know it. How broken is the system, right? We have talked with other GOP candidates in the past who are in, like, deep blue areas. And I'll tell you, man, the only reason areas are deep red or deep blue is because the parties don't invest money. They're like, what's the point? And it's like, well, dude, if you're not trying to influence people on your ideas, you're losing. And I'll tell you, it's mostly a phenomenon of the right. We mentioned this before, they don't care about culture. They're sitting there thinking that appointing federal judges is winning the culture war, and it's like, no. Because I'll tell you this, you can appoint however many judges you want, but if Amazon, CNN, cable TV, New York Times, all of these things are all saying X is right and Y is wrong, the courts are going to be like, I'll just do what they tell me, because, the courts ultimately in the end are just enforcing popular opinion. We've had a bunch of changes of precedent and over our several hundred years. Free speech as we know it, I think, was only essentially not literally codified, but precedent was set, like 1968, I think it was.
One example of this would be school prayer, right? Like, people today, a lot of people you talk to them, they're like, well, school prayer is not allowed because that's the Constitution, the Establishment Clause, blah, blah, blah. School prayer was in schools until like the 1950s or something, right? Yeah. The courts were defending it. It wasn't a matter of just like the Constitution being rewritten. It was just that the culture's perception of whether or not it's appropriate changed, right?
Yep.
And that was much more important than having a particular judge on a particular court.
So as the right, these establishment neocon Republican types keep thinking that, oh, we're gonna just win in the in the governmental policies, meaningless. Meanwhile, the left is controlling all these institutions, taking them over. So, it is a good point you bring up that someone like AOC couldn't win in a swing district. I do think there's something interesting to be said about the need for Republicans to go into an AOC type district and actually start advocating and presenting an alternative.
Well, let's remember that one of the he's obviously in a very different role these days, but one of the icons of the Republican Party, Rudy Giuliani, was only that icon because he was able to win power in New York City.
Yeah.
Now, the Republicans do have a nominee in New York City, Curtis Sliwa, who's a former, Guardian Angel. He's actually a very storied figure in many ways, but I haven't looked it up, but I doubt Republicans are investing just about anything in that race. And, and to be fair to them, I doubt that they would win it no matter what they invested, but it's a matter of long-term investment, right? It's a matter of running a series of competitive candidates until you get someone like a Rudy Giuliani who's actually going to win, who's going to pave the way for someone like a Michael Bloomberg, who is, semi-Republican. But if you don't even try, obviously you're going to end up with that result.
I think this is what's contributing to the culture war and the hyper-polarization, in that Republicans and Democrats are like, I have no reason to even talk to the people in these deep districts. And now that the hyperpolarization has gotten so extreme, now they're even more entrenched in not communicating. But if you just leave New York City to get further and further left without even trying, then we're drifting so far apart. Eventually, the band snaps, and then there's just two different realities. I think we're already starting to see it. Like Portland announced they will cut off trade and travel or whatever for Texas. California banned state travel to like a handful of states. You're going to have this phenomenon that we talked about before where truckers aren't going to go to New York. They're going to be like, I can't go there because I don't feel like dealing with the ban on public accommodations for people who aren't vaccinated. Let's say you live in Texas and you're a truck driver and they're like, hey, we got a big shipment. It's got to be sent up to New York. And be like, nah. In Texas, they don't have the restrictions. In New York, they do. They're going to be like, I don't feel like doing it, which is going to be interesting because someone in New York who's a trucker will be like, oh, I can go to Texas, no problem. So it's creating kind of a one-way track.
Yeah. I mean, this is the important thing to understand about polarization. So I actually worked on polarization professionally from 2018 and 2020. I did a fellowship at a center at Berkeley called the Greater Good Science Center, which works on psychology science. And so, I spent a lot of time talking to researchers who study it and practitioners who work on it. Here's the thing to understand about it. It's not really based on what you believe, right? It's not. There was a really great political scientist at the University of Maryland, Lydia Mason, who studied this. And what she found was that people who are most polarized from each other are people who have very strong political identities, who very strongly identify with the label like liberal or conservative. In fact, they are even more polarized from each other than people who disagree more on like an issue like guns or abortion or something. Meaning you can be all the way to the left, but if you don't identify very strongly as a leftist or a liberal, it's not a core part of your personal identity, you probably aren't going to be as angry or resentful or contemptuous of people who are all the way on the right. Versus even if you're somewhat in the middle, but you're like very strongly identifying yourself as a Democrat and you conceive of yourself as that way, you can be much, much more polarized against even someone who like agrees with you on most of the issues, but who has the opposite political identity. So I think it's really about making that political identity first and foremost, and then just not interacting very much with people with other identities. Because here's the reality. I grew up in the Deep South as a very left-leaning person. Particularly at that point, I was very left-leaning compared to everyone around me. But, all of my friends were Republicans. A lot of them hunted. You go to Waffle House, you see someone with a Confederate flag T-shirt sitting next to someone with an MLK T-shirt. Like, that was the South growing up in the 1990s. There was so much mixing and integrating and like old-fashioned diversity of like, people would look at you funny if you were like, yeah, I don't want to have any friends who are Republicans. They'd think you were some kind of freak or something, right? Like, but the Facebookification of the United States, where everyone has their kind of curtailed personality and very strong identity established through exclusively, in some cases, politics, has made it much easier for people to silo each other, to segregate from each other, and again, to elevate this part of your identity versus all other parts of your identity. It's not your hobbies, it ain't your career, it's not your religion, it's not your family life. It's, in this house, we believe XYZ. You see those signs around Northern Virginia. You see. I don't know why they're putting those signs up. Do I care what you believe? I don't really want to give someone a political litmus test upon meeting them, but that's what these people really conceive of themselves as. So
it's tribalism. I mean, and I'll tell you, I think it's look, Republicans, I think for the most part are spineless, feckless, and aren't fighting for anything. I have very little to say about a party that's not doing much. They're not coming out and demanding the Department of Gun Services and a repealing of the NFA and a gun in the hand of every child. As much as I would jokingly be like, yeah, by all means. They're not doing that. The Democrats are absolutely steamrolling, pushing, advocating very, very hard for doing these things. And then when I call out the media for lying, what happens? I mean, look at Matt Taibbi. I'm sure you get it. Glenn Greenwald gets it. You're all right-wing now. You're all right-wing grifters simply for saying, hey, media, that wasn't true.
I think part of it is that when somebody has a very strong identity, they view it as an identity threat to see someone disagree with them, right? And I think one way to resolve...
you must be the other.
Yeah, exactly. One way to resolve that threat is to simplify the world and just say, oh, that person's in the other category. It's called, what is it called? In-group homogeneity, out-group homogeneity bias, right? Where you think that everyone who disagrees with you basically has one set of narrow beliefs that all of which you hate and disagree with, right? And so, I think it would be absurd if someone were to look at my resume and to really honestly read my writing and think that, I'm a staunch right-winger or something.
They'll say it.
If I went down to my state house in Virginia or something and told them what I believe on criminal justice, they'd probably think I was like a lunatic communist or something, But if I go on Twitter and I say something that like 60% of Americans agree with, people reply saying I'm Rudy Giuliani or I'm a fascist, blah, blah, blah. And it's just like, what are you talking about? It's like, it's an alternate reality, right?
My favorite is the Satanic Temple. They're suing over the abortion bill in Texas. And so I just tweeted, I was like, so one of the tenets of the Satanic Temple is that your body is inviolable. It is yours and no one can, mess with it or whatever. And I'm like, all right, like, what's your thoughts on the New York vaccine mandate? Because I agree with you completely. And I'm pro-choice. I've always been pro-choice. I have wonderful arguments with pro-lifers, and there's a sort of a libertarian impasse we come to. And we go into great detail explaining this 50 billion times. I don't know if I can do it again. But when I post something like, my body, my choice, I get these tribal leftists on Twitter who will say, yeah, but when it comes to Texas, you pro-lifers. And I'm like, I'm not pro-life. And they're like, well, you're grifting then. And then I'm like, I'm grifting to whom? The left, who is in favor of the vax mandates by me complaining about them, or the right, who's pro-life and me saying I'm pro-choice? Who am I grifting to?
It's really funny. I think the people who tell you that, they always assume that you are captive to somebody else. They never assume that, like, let's say if someone who's very right-wing decided to have a conversation with you, that maybe you might convince them, right? Like, it actually does work both ways, but they assume it only goes one way.
Exactly. So something I've often said is politics flows in one direction. If there is a photo of me with a far-left Antifa guy, they'll accuse the Antifa guy of being right-wing. Because but like me, like I'm fairly independent, centrist, moderate, with some left-leaning policies, some right-leaning policies. But if I'm standing next to someone on the right, they'll say, aha, that proves that Tim's far right. Mm-hmm. If I stand with someone on the left, I'm like, whoa, I didn't realize that Antifa guy was actually far right. Because it only can go in one direction. There's no circumstance in which you take a right-wing individual, have him hang out and crack beers with leftists, and they claim the right-winger is a left-winger.
Which is wild, because I think that, a lot of the recent American history shows that, it's called intergroup contact or contact hypothesis, which is basically when people hang out with each other, you break down barriers between each other. So this is, for the most part, been a huge win for the left over the past 50 or 60 years of American history, right? There's been much less racial prejudice, much less religious and gender prejudice as a result of people basically just mixing it up with each other. Like, that was, you can talk about all different ways, techniques, strategies to make this happen, but ultimately it was people mixing up with each other. It was integrating, right?
Yep.
People just getting to know each other, being friends, has made America one of the most tolerant places, like, on planet Earth. And like in human history, generally it's worked out very well for left-wing goals, I would say.
Absolutely, I agree. Thanks for checking out this clip from the Timcast IRL podcast. If you want to see the full show, come back to this channel, youtube.com/TimcastIRL, Monday through Friday at 8 p.m., where you can leave comments and super chat, and we actually will read your comments on the show. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and if you want exclusive members-only content, segments you can't get anywhere else, go to timcast.com, become a member, and we even have full bonus episodes. Thanks for hanging out, and we'll see you all next time.